You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Children as young as 4 are copying violent scenes that they've seen in video games. The warning came from the former president of the Association of Teachers and Lecturers, who said that widespread access to horrific video games is responsible for an increase in aggressive behaviour at school. Alison Sherratt said that teachers are witnessing a rise in hitting, hurting and thumping in playgrounds. Joining me to discuss the link between video games and violent behaviour are Dr. Joan Harvey, a chartered psychologist at Newcastle University, Daniel Griliopoulos, a video games journalist, Dr. Simon Goodson, senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University. Vincent Shearer is a lawyer on the board of TIGA, that's the trade association representing the UK's game industry, and Daniel Stapleton is a 13-year-old console gamer. A good place to begin, I guess, is Dr. Joan Harvey. You're a chartered psychologist at Newcastle University. What link have you found between violent scenes in video games and the effect on behaviour?
There was a big study a couple of years ago by Tanya Byron, who's a famous clinical psychologist, who did talk about links between violence and behaviour, but she didn't particularly isolate computer games because there is so much violence on television, including stuff that's shown on the news as well. So what she's saying is that depictions of violence can influence behaviour, but she would also be suggesting, I think, that it's not everybody that is equally affected. So we actually need to look at who some of these people are. In other words, children that perhaps are being violent in the playground probably have got some history and, if you like, societal reasons behind that, in addition to their own personal development, that predispose them towards that.
Dr. Simon Goodson, you're a senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University. Would you agree with what Dr. Joan Harvey's saying?
Definitely. I would think that people that have issues with video games might have some underlying medical problems, mental health problems, or just behavioural problems that stem from the family or the environment they're living in. If you look at the number of people that play video games, it must be in the region of 300 million. You take in account of about 4 or 5 people that commit, horrific crimes. There's no statistical analysis that would give you any weight saying that video games are causing these behaviours to occur at all.
There seems to be a link, though, that the video games are influencing the behaviour of the people who are already predisposed.
This is very small numbers. I mean, it could be anything. It could be cartoons. Cartoons have been blamed. Before video games, it was video nasties. You remember The Bride of Chucky and the Bulger murders. It was comic books before that. They always look for a scapegoat in society to blame things from, and video games are now the biggest media platform on the planet, so it's the obvious choice.
Vincent Shearer, a lawyer on the board of TIGA, that's the trade association representing the UK's game industry. What are your thoughts about the link between violent scenes in games and also the effect on behaviour?
Well, I think Dr. Joan Harvey is right to cite the Byron Review, which was a review commissioned by Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister, to look at violence and the influence of violence in games and also the internet on children specifically. And she looked through this. She's not just a TV personality, she's an expert. And she said that there is no convincing evidence at the moment in all the tests. There are some people who say that violent products can cause violence amongst children, others that say it's just simply not proven. And her ultimately what she recommended, which I think everyone would agree with, is that ultimately you've got to make sure people know what kind of games are being played in the home by children in particular, and make sure that children don't play games that are not the right games for their age group. But this is something that the video games industry is able to do fairly well at the moment. Video games are fairly clearly age-rated. From a personal level, I would be astonished if video games caused violence, not just because I've played video games, including violent video games, all my life. So is everyone else I know. No one that I know has ever gone out and demonstrated any form of violence. All right, it's a sample of just me, but the idea that somehow video games could cause me to be violent, I find astonishing and weird. and not something that I would agree with at all, just on any level, on a scientific level or even on a personal level.
But we are seeing very dangerous scenes carried out in these video games. Grand Theft Auto, you can set people on fire, you can shoot them, you can beat them to death. Mad World 2, that was banned in Germany, where a character has his arm replaced by a chainsaw and goes around hacking off people's arms and limbs. That can't be good for children to see at a young age.
Well, we certainly agree that children shouldn't be playing Grand Theft Auto. I mean, Grand Theft Auto is an 18-rated game, and Mad World, I couldn't tell you the rating off the top of my head. I would guess by your description it's an 18-rated game. I wouldn't put my kids in front of a violent movie, and I wouldn't put my kids in front of a violent game.
Do you think that's the crux of it, then? Is that you're a father of 2 children, but you said you wouldn't put your children in front of such games, but there obviously are parents putting their very young children in front of these games. Is that the problem here?
I don't know if it's a problem. There is certainly anecdotal evidence to show that parents don't necessarily understand violent video games as being on a par with violent movies. So they wouldn't show an 18 film to a 10-year-old, but they might let a 10-year-old play an 18 game, just through not knowing themselves, not being themselves gamers. That's a generational thing which will change when the current generation, who's always played games, kind of has its own cohort of children. But that's just anecdotal evidence. Undoubtedly, if you put a 9-year-old in front of a game that's suitable for 18, that's not great. But even then, there simply, again, isn't any evidence of 9-year-olds going around hijacking cars or setting people on fire. The only thing I think we could say statistically is that since games have been around the last 30 years, the one thing you can show statistically is that violent crime has decreased in the last 30 years. That is the only statistic. I mean, I'm not saying that the two are connected,
yeah.
But one has to point to that at the same time and to put this overall into context.
But there possibly isn't a link just because crime has gone down and video games use has increased. Doesn't mean the two are necessarily connected.
No, of course not.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the link between video games and violent behaviour. Joining me to discuss this issue is Dr. Joan Harvey, a chartered psychologist at Newcastle University, Daniel Griliopoulos, a video games journalist, Dr. Simon Goodson, senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University, Vincent Shearer is a lawyer on the board of TIGA, the trade association representing the UK's game industry, and Daniel Stapleton is a 13-year-old console gamer. Daniel, you're a 13-year-old console gamer. You play these games yourself. What effect do you think they have on behaviour? Do you ever feel like it ever affects how you feel or your mood when you're playing them?
Well, personally, I do notice there is changes. Like, of course, like if you play games like Call of Duty, when you're shooting other people, and let's say you've just been in a group and then you just get shot and you're quite angry. I don't think it's sort of permanent anger. Of course, it would change your mood, but it doesn't really. If you were to come off it, you wouldn't like long after go out and do something to take out your anger. Of course, if you personally are a bit unstable, then maybe from past experience you might get a bit. You might take it a bit more than just a game, and you'll actually take it out. But on the whole, I feel that I do get angry, but I would not, do anything to hurt anyone else just because I've gone out and shot loads of people in a game.
So you see it as more of a short-term impact on your behaviour, perhaps if you're maybe interrupted in the middle of a game?
Yeah, pretty much.
Why do you think that is? Is that because you're so engrossed in the film or the game?
Because video games, it's very excitable. You get really. It's almost like you feel almost like you've got adrenaline, but like sort of a fake version. So you're like in it, and you feel as if you were in a game. But as soon as you're taken from it, you just remember that's all a game, and it's just, it's not real.
Sure. Dr. Simon Goodson, senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University. What are your thoughts about what Daniel Stapleton just said?
It raises an interesting point there, that people assume that it's the game that make people angry. It's the competitiveness. It's inferring one thing onto another. So, like you see people playing football, they get very competitive. Footballers get angry and lash out. It's not the game; it's the you against them. He specifically mentioned when he was playing in online matches against people, it's the being beaten by somebody else or not being the best. It's not the game itself. I'd just like to go back to Grand Theft Auto as well while we mention that, because there's about 35 million copies of that franchise being sold, and so far there's only one person that's actually tried to use that as a defence. That was Devin Moore in 2003 in June, where he went into a police station and killed somebody, and his defence lawyer said it was because he was trained by Grand Theft Auto, and that was thrown out. He's on death row. So out of all those millions of copies of the game sold, we've got one case where somebody's trying to blame their actions on that game. So it's a very low proportion.
Daniel was saying the impact is maybe on his short-term behaviour rather than his long-term behaviour. He said it, aside from the competitiveness, being interrupted in the middle of the game led to a change in behaviour.
There's a lot of research from, I think it's Chris Ferguson in America, that looks at very short-term changes. Obviously, as much as a film would scare you, but that passes quickly. There's no change in behaviour after all. You quite rightly pointed out that people realise it's a game and it's not real. So you get, the frustration from being beaten. Dr.
Harvey, you've looked at both the positive aspect and the negative aspect that such games can have on behaviour. And what correlation have you found?
If you're watching stuff on the television, and there's been an awful lot of coverage of what's going on in Syria, for example, of late, what happens is that people become desensitised to the sort of violence that they're seeing there. So, and that could last for a long time. In the same way, there's it's sometimes referred to as psychological numbing. When you see these adverts for giving money to charities, and you're told about millions of people that are dying of starvation, and you see these terribly, terribly sad pictures on the television, and we're becoming desensitized to a lot of that. Now, that's real desensitization. It's quite difficult to translate that into the extent to which people become desensitized in games, and it's much more difficult to make that sort of link directly. So, and you've also got to refer to what we've just said about competitiveness, that if terribly, terribly involved in a game and you're cut off from it, or you suddenly lose something, or a goal scored against you if it's in a real game, or you crash if you're playing Super Mario Kart or something like that, then there's an instant problem because your adrenaline's been racing when you've been involved in those games. But over the longer term, you go out the room and you go and eat a sandwich and you go to the toilet and you phone your friend, and the world's gone quite quickly back to normal. So trying to talk about long-term effects of these, I'm more worried about the long-term desensitization to all the stuff that you're seeing on the television.
What impact are you worried that would have?
Well, we become desensitized, so we just tolerate the fact that people are dying all over the place, in much the same way that we tolerate the fact that we kill several hundred people a year just in the UK alone, and goodness knows how many, for example, in Russia every year are killed on the roads, and we become desensitized to that until it becomes very close to us, and then all of a sudden our risk perception rises and we become more worried about it.
You worried that would lead to inaction rather than action? Then?
Well, it doesn't stop you going out and driving like a nutcase in your car.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the link between video games and violent behaviour. Joining me to discuss this issue is Dr. Joan Harvey, a chartered psychologist at Newcastle University, Daniel Griliopoulos, a video games journalist, Dr. Simon Goodson, senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University, Vincent Shearer is a lawyer on the board of TIGA, the trade association representing the UK's game industry, and Daniel Stapleton is a 13-year-old console gamer. Dr. Goodson, Dr. Harvey's just told us there's a desensitisation. If we then translate that over to video games, say, for example, we'll take the driving analogy that she used. If someone's driving very quickly down a game, they're racing through the streets, it desensitises them then, we would assume, to speed limits on the roads.
I wouldn't have thought that it was transferred into real behaviour, because there's always that knowledge when you're playing a game, it's not real, you can do things that you can't do in real life.
But Dr. Harvey's just said that it is affecting behaviour because it's leading people to be desensitised. Say, for example, she said about Syria, about driving, people aren't reacting as much then.
I've done a lot of research on video games, and it's a good lead-in, but I've done some research for using driving games, comparing them to aggressive games and also football games. And we've looked at brain activity. We've not looked at like paper-based measures. We've looked at brain activity. We found there's a lot more brain activity when people are playing a game such as football or driving, because it's real in a way that people can relate to it. So when they're killing somebody with a gun, there's very little brain activity, but when they're playing a driving game and there's that competition again, there's a lot more brain activity, especially in the emotional areas associated in the brain. And we found this now on numerous occasions. We haven't actually been able to replicate any deep-rooted emotional responses to violent video games. And we've looked at specific acts in a video game, like a premeditated tackle or a foul, and then sneaking up and shooting somebody. There's a lot more activity in the brain for football than there is for a violent game. Exactly the same with driving, because there's that reality and relate to. So I think the impact of video game is very short term. You know, when you're playing a video game, you won't die. If you don't, then you've got other underlying mental health problems. You know that, I think it was Daniel Petrick in America was called the Halo 3 killer. He killed his parent, shot his mum and dad in the head in bed because he took Halo 3 off him, and his mother died. His dad survived, and he thought they would be regenerated like characters in the game. So in there's underlying mental health problems.
But these video games aren't helping then?
Well, again, you're talking about one person in 3 million, 30 million. You know, Peter Sutcliffe looked at a Polish gravestone and became the Yorkshire Ripper. We should ban people from seeing gravestones.
That's making it a bit of a tenuous link there.
It's not, because
we've highlighted a couple of cases already where we've seen behaviour being linked to video games.
Yeah, but they're in the sort of small minority. You've the recent case of Daniel Bartlam that beat his mother to death with a hammer because he's watched Coronation Street. By that reckoning, then we should ban all soap operas because they're people acting them out. You've got one person in, how many people watched that episode? About 19 million. It is so finite that there's other underlying mental health problems, and people just inferring that it's the video games or a program because these person played a video game and they did this act, and they just ignore the millions and millions of other people that play games and do nothing. You can't. It doesn't work like that. You can't sort of single out one person and say video games make you into a killer.
So they might not make someone of a normal disposition, but maybe someone that is prone to mental health issues. It might not help them then.
That anything could be a key. It could be a comic book. It could be a conversation in the street. It could be an advert on television for Lynx deodorant. It could be anything.
Okay, well, I'm going to go to something that Miss Sherratt said. She's the former president of the ATL. We're looking. You've mentioned studies that you've seen within the laboratory and the tests you've done on brain studies. This is something that she saw in her playground. She's a teacher in Keighley in West Yorkshire. She said a class of 4 and 5-year-olds were seen in the playground throwing themselves out of the window of a play car in slow motion and acting out blood spurting from their bodies to mimic the scenes from violent games. She said it made her then reflect on what the children have been playing over the last few years and realise we've noticed a marked increase in the aggression in general. What would you say to that then? She's seeing it in the playground.
Yeah, but she's making like an observation. If you look in recent court cases in America, there's been no evidence provided to say that violent video games make people more aggressive. They could be just acting out things from films. There's the parental responsibility as well. You know, if a game's an 18, then 4 and 5-year-olds shouldn't be playing it.
You mentioned responsibility. I want to come to Vincent Shearer. You're a lawyer on the board of TIGA, the trade association representing the UK's game industry. They're producing very violent video games. What are they doing about it?
Well, let me just say for Grand Theft Auto. Grand Theft Auto 4 sold $500 million in 1 week. It's a British-made game. I'm not aware of any other British-made creative work in the history of this country that has sold as well as GTA. And we shouldn't forget that it's an extremely successful creative work, one which we as a country ought to be extremely proud of. Grand Theft Auto is an 18 game. It's for people of 18 and over. To be honest, I'd be astonished if anyone in their right mind would let a 5-year-old play it. I mean, that 15-year-olds playing Call of Duty, that kind of thing, that happens fairly frequently. 5-year-olds playing GTA, That is bonkers. And anyone who's doing that needs to have their head examined themselves for letting their children do that. The idea that children will mimic things that they see, it seems perfectly normal. My children mimic stuff that they see on TV all the time, that they see in video games all the time. That's all perfectly normal. Are they becoming desensitized, or are they becoming in any way worse as a result of mimicking violent games? That's the bit that simply has never been proven. And as Simon said, not only has it not been proven, but it's been alleged many times. You can imagine how many people try to sue the makers of Grand Theft Auto, who make a lot of money out of those products, to get some money because someone's been injured in a shooting or something, and everyone ends up blaming the game. Even that has never been proven in court. It's never, because ultimately there simply isn't the evidence for it.
How wide is the use of, say, 18-related games or age-regulated games among the younger audience that shouldn't be having access to them?
Well, that I don't have the statistics. I'm not sure a great many people do. At the moment in the UK, you cannot buy an 18-rated game if you're a child.
We've got Daniel Stapleton here. Daniel, how many? You're 13. How many games have you got access to that you probably shouldn't?
Quite a lot. Most of the games I have actually are 18s or 15s, but surprisingly I've actually got more 15s than 18s, because personally I do not actually like games like Grand Theft Auto.
Who bought the games for you?
Well...
Or did you buy them yourself?
Parents bought most of the games.
Do you think it's their responsibility to make sure that you don't have access to these games and you should be playing games more suited to your age?
Well,
or are they not exciting enough?
Yeah, no, I do think it is up to them to decide whether or not to allow their parents, because most things like PG, like films and stuff, it's like parent guided, so the parents are the ones who sort of let their children do that. Obviously, for things like parents letting 4 or 5-year-olds play GTA is a bit going bit crazy. But things like if a parent lets a child get a game that they probably shouldn't, it's really if their parents really trust them as well. So, how
many games have you got access to, or have you bought that are specifically that you would be legally allowed to have?
About 5.
And how many have you got that you shouldn't do?
About 8.
Why do you think that you've got probably more than you shouldn't have, than you do that you should have?
It's actually mainly because the games that are being released nowadays are actually seem to be more popular are the ones that are over the age rating. Like you probably don't hear of the next Viva Pinata game as often as you would hear or the next Call of Duty game or Medal of Honor or something that's that should be an 18 game or a 15 game.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the link between video games and violent behaviour. Now, Vincent, you're shaking your head here. What are your thoughts? Daniel's saying, well, there are better games coming out that are of a higher age.
Well, certainly a lot of the good games that I, as an adult, would say are good games are high age, and undoubtedly. But I think it's not right. I'm not blaming Daniel for this, by the way, but statistically it's incorrect to say that the majority of games are 18 or 15. They're not. So the majority of games are for any players. It's just that I think if you're a teenager, you're going to tend to gravitate towards some of the ones that are slightly more edgy. But that's natural teenager behaviour. I find myself now playing Mario Kart, revisiting Paper Mario from 2001 with my kids. Most of the games I'm playing now, with a couple of exceptions, I play Call of Duty, I play Uncharted, but most of the games now I play aren't rated for adults at all. And actually the majority of popular ones aren't.
Daniel Koplewicz, what are the most popular games out at the moment, and what ages are they?
Well, the most popular games around at the moment are iPhone games, mobile games, social games, and those aren't age-rated, but most of them are accessible to everybody. The games that Daniel is playing are ones that he's driven to by marketing from big game companies, and that sector of the market is probably shrinking, if anything, And the iPhone games, the mobile games, the social games are taking over.
If we look at the video games then, what are we seeing as the most popular? Call of Duty seems to be banded about quite a lot, Uncharted.
There are definitely huge AAA sellers which reach the global market and sell 500 million copies like Call of Duty. The ones that do really well are on the iPad and iPhone, and they're available to everybody, and they sell really well. Angry Birds is a classic example. It's a 99p game which has made how many sales? I don't know, several, maybe 30 million sales or something like that.
70.
70.
Dr. Joan Harvey, a chartered psychologist at Newcastle University. Vincent mentioned that the children are prone to mimic behaviour and things that they've learned that they've seen on TV. Do you think it could ever go as extreme as what they've seen in video games?
Oh, I guess people could mimic what they've seen in video games, but you only have to look at a Bruce Lee film to see, and all these kung fu films, to look at things they could mimic. I'm not convinced that the violence in the video games is significantly any worse than watching violent television programs. I don't see why it should be. It's a virtual world, and you can disengage from it, which makes it different to violence on the television.
Vincent Shearer, as a lawyer on the board of TIGA, the trade association representing the UK's game industry, from what you're saying and from what everyone's saying at the moment, video games are coming under attack. They have no relation at all to this violent behaviour that we've seen in these isolated cases, as Dr. Goodson has been saying. What is the next step then? If we are seeing video games being blamed for this violent behaviour, the real answer, as far as Dr. Goodson is concerned and the studies that he's referenced are concerned, it's not them at all.
Well, the answer is exactly what happened with the last moral panic, which is video nasties, and then before then comic books, before then rock and roll music, before then the novel, is that the people in charge, the generation who run the country, will ultimately be the people who ended up playing games when they were kids. And when that happens, which is starting to happen at the moment, we're going to no longer see video games being singled out as the cause of all the world's ills. So, for example, in the House of Commons, until very recently, the only MPs that had any interest in video games, people like Keith Vaz, who just simply insisted on that video games are the source of all evil. And now we have MPs like Tom Watson, who grew up as gamers and say, no, that's total nonsense. I play video games, my kids play video games, we all play video games. The majority of this country plays video games. The average age of a gamer in this country is something like 33. There's no problem with them at all. And the Vaz position, which is that games cause everything that's wrong in this world, is simply literally going to evolve and die out in the same way that people like him were saying the same about video nasties. Now video nasties are being classified as almost children, as almost for children. So films that were banned as X-rated in the 70s are now, they're not 18, they're 15. Things change. But that's largely because because the people who kind of run the country change. And when we have gamers in the House, in number 10, and gamers throughout the House of Commons, then people will look for something else to blame.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. My thanks to my guests, Dr. Joan Harvey, a chartered psychologist at Newcastle University, Daniel Griliopoulos, a video games journalist, Dr. Simon Goodson, senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University, Vincent Shearer is a lawyer on the board of TIGA, the trade association representing the UK's game industry, and Daniel Stapleton is a 13-year-old console gamer.
As well. So what she's saying is that depictions of violence can influence behaviour, but she would also be suggesting, I think, that it's not everybody that is equally affected. So we actually need to look at who some of these people are. In other words, children that perhaps are being violent in the playground probably have got some history and, if you like, societal reasons behind that, in addition to their own personal development, that predispose them towards that.
Dr. Simon Goodson, you're a senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University. Would you agree with what Dr. Joan Harvey's saying?
Definitely. I would think that people that have issues with video games might have some underlying medical problems, mental health problems, or just behavioural problems that stem from the family or the environment they're living in. If you look at the number of people that play video games, it must be the regional
University. Daniel Griliopoulos, a video games journalist. Dr. Simon Goodson, senior lecturer in psychology at Huddersfield University. Vincent Shearer is a lawyer on the board of TIGA, that's the trade association representing the UK's game industry. And Daniel Stapleton is a 13-year-old console gamer. A good place to begin, I guess, is Dr. Joan Harvey. You're a chartered psychologist at Newcastle University. What link have you found between violent scenes in video games and the effect on behaviour?
There was a big study a couple of years ago by Tanya Byron, who's a famous clinical psychologist, who did talk about links between violence and behaviour, but she didn't particularly isolate computer games because there is so much violence on television, including stuff that's shown on the news.
300 million, you take in account of about 4 or 5 people that commit, horrific crimes. There's no statistical analysis that would give you any weight saying that video games are causing these behaviours to occur at all.
There seems to be a link, though, that the video games are influencing the behaviour of the people who are already predisposed.
This is very small numbers. I mean, it could be anything. It could be cartoons. Cartoons have been blamed. Before video games, it was video nasties. You remember The Bride of Chucky and the Bulger murders. It was comic books before that. They always look for a scapegoat in society to blame things from, and video games are now the biggest media platform on the planet, so it's the obvious choice.
Vincent Shearer, a lawyer on the board of TIGA, that's the trade association representing the UK's game industry. What are your thoughts about the link between violent scenes in games and also the effect on behaviour?
Well, I think Dr. Joan Harvey is right to cite the Byron Review, which was a review commissioned by Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister, to look at violence and the influence of violence in games and also the internet on children specifically. And she looked through this. She's not just a TV personality, she's an expert. And she said that there is no convincing evidence at the moment in all the tests. There are some people who say that violent products can cause violence amongst children, others that say it's just simply not proven. And ultimately what she recommended, which I think everyone would agree with, is that ultimately you've got to make sure people know what kind of games are being played in the home by children in particular, and make sure that children don't play games that are not the right games for their age group. But this is something that the video games industry is able to do fairly well at the moment. Video games are fairly clearly age-rated.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Children as young as 4 are copying violent scenes that they've seen in video games. The warning came from the former president of the Association of Teachers and Lecturers, who said that widespread access to horrific video games is responsible for an increase in aggressive behaviour at school. Alison Sherratt said that teachers are witnessing a rise in hitting, hurting and thumping in playgrounds. Joining me to discuss the link between video games and violent behaviour are Dr. Joan Harvey, a chartered psychologist at Newcastle